My grandma used to tell me scary stories when I was little. There's one I only just remembered. Final part. Don't. My words were only a half whisper, but something in my voice made Tim pause, still clutching the doorknob. He turned to look at me and the grin on his face grew wider as he saw the fear on mine. When he next spoke, his voice was a parody of shock and concern. Oh no, did I get the special needs knock wrong? Did I make it all scary for poor little Christopher? Tim pouted out his lower lip. Is little Christopher scared of the big bad monsters in the cupboard? I listened for the whistling noise beyond the door, for any noise beyond the door, but could no longer hear anything. Don't open it, Tim. I'm serious. Oh, you're serious. Are you? Oh, okay. I didn't realize how serious you were. I wouldn't want you telling your mummy on me. Tim took his hand away from the door and rolled his eyes, turned away. I felt my body begin to untense, but just as I was turning away too, Tim spun back round and grabbed for the doorknob. Terror rolled through me in a sick wave. I turned just in time to see the cupboard door flying open. I opened my mouth to scream, but the sound died in my throat when I saw what was on the other side. Nothing at all. Just some clothes hanging up, and toys littering the floor. The exact same view I had whenever I looked in the cupboard. Nothing else. Oh wow, the look on your face. I turned to see Tim with his hands on his knees, his body shaking with laughter. You looked like you were gonna wet yourself. Oh Chris, the guys at school are gonna love this. I felt my cheeks burning. I turned away from Tim and stared into the shadows of the cupboard. Told myself I wouldn't cry. Told myself Tim would be gone in the morning anyway. I turned away from the cupboard and walked back across my room, towards my single bed. Where are you going to sleep? What's wrong, Christopher? Did your special needs cupboard not work? Shut up. I was halfway across the room by that point. But when the cupboard door slammed shut behind me, I jumped. I looked back and saw Tim standing in front of it, staring after me, no longer laughing. What did you just say? Just leave me alone, Tim. I'm going to sleep, and you should as well. If you keep banging around, Mum's gonna hear you, and then we'll both get grounded. Tim's frown deepened for a moment, and then faded. He glanced towards the bedroom door. As he paused to listen, I knew he could hear what I heard, footsteps on the stairs. The TV had gone off, and my parents were getting ready for bed. Tim looked back at me and shrugged, but when he next spoke, he'd lowered his voice. Whatever, I'm bored anyway. There's never anything to do around here. He made his way over to his sleeping bag, which was set up near the bedroom door. I walked over to my desk and switched the lamp off, then made my own way to bed. I suddenly felt exhausted. As I clambered under the covers, I heard Tim's voice, a soft hiss in the darkness. Night-night, Christopher. Don't let the cupboard monsters bite. His laughter followed me into an uneasy sleep. It was a noise that woke me, a soft tapping, like fingertips drumming on wood. I had a vision of Tim at my desk, tapping his fingers against the surface while he switched the lamp on and off. But when I creaked my eyes open, the room was still dark, and my desk chair was empty. Tap, tap. Tap, 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 tap. I hadn't dreamed it. The sound was still there, constant and steady. Tap, 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 coming from the far side of the bedroom. Dread surged through my chest and stomach, forcing me fully awake. I lifted my head from my pillow slowly and peered into the shadows. Tim was standing in front of the cupboard, his back facing towards me, blonde hair sticking up in clumps, still messy from sleep. As I watched, he took a step closer to it, then another. Finally, he began to reach out a hand, as if in slow motion, for the cupboard's doorknob. Tim, I spoke in a low hiss. Tim, what are you doing? He didn't react, just kept reaching his hand out, his fingertips now inches from the door. Tap, tap, tap. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was growing louder, more insistent. It was coming from inside the cupboard. As I kicked back the duvet and swung my legs out, Grandma's words raced through my mind. Whatever you do, don't open the door. Don't open it, no matter what you hear on the other side. Tim, I hissed his name again as my feet hit the carpet. He didn't react. From the way he was moving, I had the idea he might still be unconscious. Either that or in some sort of trance. Tap, tap, tap. Tap, tap, tap. Louder still. As I hurried across the room, Tim's fingertips found the doorknob. The tapping sound stopped. I skidded to a stop a few feet from where he stood, terror rooting me in place. "Tim, don't," he half stirred. I saw his head move, turning slightly towards me. I caught a glimpse of one green eye, open but glazed out. Then Tim tugged the door open. The hinges squealed as it moved. Tim hadn't put much force behind his pull, so the door creaked open slowly, and it didn't open all the way, only about a foot, but that was enough. It was enough for me to glimpse the swirling, ink-thick blackness beyond. A darkness that was far too dense to be explained away with shadows. It was enough for me to hear the distant howling, like storm wind battering the eaves of a dilapidated house. And it was enough for me to feel a sense of dread that was worse than anything I'd ever felt before in my life. "Tim. Tim, wake up." My voice wasn't any louder, but this time it seemed to get through. Tim let go of the doorknob. He turned towards me. I saw him blink rapidly, saw the glazed look leave his face. For a second, his green eyes found mine. He opened his mouth to say something, and then long fingers stretched from the cupboard and found his throat. I didn't scream. I couldn't. I could only stare on in shock as the fingers wrapped themselves around his neck. Gaga. Tim tried to speak, but he couldn't. He could only make the same strangled noise, like a baby struggling to make itself understood. Gaga. I listened to that noise in horror, still rooted to the spot. Time was moving impossibly slowly. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in place on the carpet. I only know it was long enough. Long enough for me to get a clear view of those fingers, which were like a cross between tree branches and tentacles, tightening on Tim's throat. Long enough for me to see his strained face turning from red to purple, to watch as the veins in his forehead stood out like worms beneath the skin. Long enough for me to see him stretching out a hand towards me, the fingers flailing in my direction while the terror grew on his face. That was what finally snatched me out of my shock. Tim's hand. Something about seeing Tim, a kid who dominated playgrounds and sports fields for as long as I'd known him, reaching out towards me with desperation in his eyes, without pausing to think what I was doing. I ran forwards and grabbed him. I grabbed his hand. For just a second, I felt his grip tightening on mine. Wine howled in the distance. My eyes locked on Tim's, and then, with the force of a plaster being ripped from a cut, Tim was snatched backwards. 1 minute he was holding my hand, the next he'd vanished. I had a brief impression of him flying through the air, screaming as he was pulled through the dark gap in the cupboard door. Then he was gone. His cries swallowed by the distant wind. I stared down at my empty hand, too many emotions raging through me to process, and only looked up again when I heard the crash of the cupboard door banging shut. By the time I heard footsteps and voices on the landing beyond my room, I'd started to cry. Tim was never seen again, gone without a trace. When my parents first came into my bedroom that night, they thought it was all a game. Hide and seek got out of hand. I kept telling them Tim was in the cupboard, but whenever my dad opened it to check, he couldn't find anything, just the same old piles of clothes and toys. Later, when the police came, I told them the same thing I'd eventually told my parents, that I'd seen something grab Tim and pull him into the cupboard. A hand that came out of the darkness and wrapped itself around his neck. None of them believed me. Why would they have? Looking back, I can see myself through their eyes, just an upset, terrified little kid whose friend had gone missing. Maybe they thought I'd had a nightmare, or maybe they thought I had seen something, an abductor pulling Tim through the bedroom window. Perhaps, but my frightened mind had simply confused the details. Either way, whenever I mentioned the cupboard, they dismissed it. There was only one person who didn't. We were already in our new home when I next saw Grandma, our second one, a few towns over. At the time, I hadn't really understood why we were moving. I'd overheard Dad telling Mom that the talking would never stop if we didn't leave. But I hadn't really got what he meant. I didn't care, though. Moving meant I could go to a new school and get away from all the whispering kids in the playground. It also meant I'd never have to see Tim's mom, who turned up outside the school gates one day to scream questions at me. again. But mostly, it meant I could get away from the cupboard. It meant I could sleep. My parents had eventually set my bed up in the spare room when I refused to step back into my own bedroom, but even that hadn't helped. Not really, because I still knew it was in there. I could still feel it. The thought of that cupboard was like a horrible itch in my mind. I kept wanting to scratch at it, but that only made it worse. Moving house got me far away from it, once and for all. And a couple of weeks after we'd moved, I finally saw Grandma. I'd been asking Mom and Dad if I could see her ever since the night Tim disappeared, but they'd kept putting me off. Said it wasn't the right time, and I could see Grandma once everything was more settled. But finally, after our furniture was moved in and they grew fed up with my pestering, I got my wish. Grandma came round for the evening, and at bedtime I asked if she could come up to tuck me in. She agreed. The second the door to my new room was shut, I started babbling, telling her about the cupboard door and the special knock. About how we knocked 13 times. About what happened to Tim. She listened at first, but as I grew more and more worked up, she finally came over and started stroking my hair. "SHH, sweetheart," Grandma whispered. "It's okay. It's going to be okay, SHHH. You're safe now. But can the thing in the cupboard find me here?" "What?" No, you don't need to worry about anything in the cupboard. The magic words only work once, and I don't have to use them again if you don't want me to. I meant you're safe from him." "From who?" "From that boy who was bullying you, sweetheart." "From Timothy." Grandma smiled and stroked my cheek. "Your little friend's in the Blacklands now." The temperature in my room was warm, but my skin suddenly felt cold. I stared up at Grandma. What do you mean?" She sighed. "Don't you remember when I last came to see you, and I tucked you in? You'd been crying, and you had a cut lip. And before I told you about the special knock, you told me that your friend, a boy called Timothy, had tripped you up in the playground. You said he did it in front of the girls in your class, and they'd all laughed at you." I stared at Grandma, thought back to the last time I'd seen her. I remembered the feeling of having cried recently, and I remembered the cut in my lip. Remembered probing at it with my tongue while Grandma spoke, but I couldn't remember telling her. About Tim tripping me. Tim was, I grasped for the right words, and came up short. "Tim's my friend, Grandma. Well, I'll tell you something for free, sweetheart. Anyone who hurts you to make themselves feel bigger is not your friend." Grandma frowned for a second, then smiled again. "But like I said, you don't need to worry about him anymore. Timothy's in the Blacklands, and he'll never get out." Grandma leaned down towards me. Her breath smelled like sweets and mint. "I can't have anyone hurting my Christopher. Can I now give your grandma a big kiss and say thank you?" She leaned closer to me. There were so many questions and emotions swirling through me that my head felt like it was going to burst. I almost flinched away from Grandma, but I stopped myself at the last minute. As her face came closer to mine, instinct kicked in. "Thank you, Grandma," I mumbled, giving her a kiss on the cheek. "You're welcome, Christopher," she whispered.